Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. 8 years of sonar work, and I can read a return the way some people read faces. You develop a feel for it. The seafloor has a language, the way sediment layers compress, the way rock formations scatter sound differently depending on their density and composition, the way a pipeline or a cable shows up as a clean, hard line against the softer signatures of the geology around it. After enough time, you stop seeing the data as data and start seeing it as a place, a texture, a picture of the bottom of the world built entirely out of sound. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that what I saw on that survey wasn't something I misread. It wasn't operator error, and it wasn't equipment malfunction, and it wasn't a processing artifact. I know what those look like too. I've been doing this long enough to have seen all the ways the data can lie to you. And I know how to check. I checked several times. What was in that basin was real, and it had been there for a very long time. The vessel I was working on was a mid-sized survey ship contracted to a private oceanographic firm out of Vancouver. I won't name the company. They're still operating, and I'm not interested in causing them professional problems. But I'll tell you the job. We were running a resurvey of a section of the North Pacific, out past the shelf break, over deep water, an area we'd mapped 4 years earlier as part of a fiber optic cable route assessment. The cable had since been laid and was operational, and the resurvey was standard maintenance protocol, checking for any geological changes, sediment shifts, anything that might affect the infrastructure. It's the kind of work that sounds tedious from the outside and mostly is. You're comparing new data against old data, looking for differences, flagging anything significant and discarding everything that isn't. Most of the time there's nothing significant. The seafloor is stable over short timescales. A 4-year gap between surveys is nothing geologically. You expect to find the same picture you left. That's exactly why the anomaly stopped me. I was running the new returns against the old survey data about 2 days into the job, working through the basin sections systematically the way you do, and I hit a section that didn't match. My first instinct was instrument calibration, a bad return, a processing hiccup, something in the data pipeline generating a false signature. I ran the checks. Everything came back clean. I pulled the old data up in a split window and put the 2 images side by side. The basin in the old data was flat, wide, featureless, the kind of deep seafloor that looks almost peaceful in sonar. Smooth gradients, soft acoustic returns, the geological equivalent of a quiet room, about 4 miles down. Nothing notable about it in the previous survey. We'd noted it as a stable, unremarkable section and moved on. In the new data, something was sitting in it. Large is an understatement, but it's where I'll start. The return was dense, denser than rock, which already put it outside the normal range of what you'd expect in a sedimentary basin, and organized. That was the part that made me sit back in my chair. Sediment displacement has a signature. Geological uplift has a signature. Debris fields, hydrothermal structures, manganese nodule formations, they all have signatures I know. This didn't match any of them. The density was too consistent. The organization of it was too uniform. It read like something with internal coherence, rather than something deposited or formed by the usual geological processes. My first thought was that something man-made had ended up down there, a wreck maybe, or some large piece of infrastructure. But the size was wrong for that. The return covered an area that I had to check 3 times because I kept getting the same number and not believing it. I went and found Dr. Vance. Petra Vance was our lead researcher, a marine geologist from Halifax who had been working deep ocean surveys longer than I had. She was in her late 40s, precise in her thinking, and she had the specific quality that distinguishes good scientists from mediocre ones. She was skeptical of everything, including her own conclusions. She didn't dismiss things easily, and she didn't accept them easily either. She just looked at them until she understood them, or until she understood that she didn't understand them, which she treated as equally valid outcomes. She looked at my split-screen comparison for a long time without saying anything. Then she asked me to walk her through my calibration checks. I did. She asked follow-up questions, technical ones, the kind that were designed to find a gap in my process. There wasn't a gap. I'd been thorough because I'd known before I went to her that thorough was the only way she'd take it seriously. She straightened up. She looked at the screen again. She said she wanted eyes on it. She ordered an ROV deployment for the following morning. I want to describe the ROV feed carefully because it's the part of this I keep returning to, the part that I think about when I'm trying to explain to myself why this particular job stayed with me the way it did. 4 miles is a long way down. The descent takes time, long enough that you sit in the control room with the screen showing nothing but a slow drift of particles in the light marine snow, the constant gentle fall of organic material from the surface. It looks like driving through light rain. The floor doesn't appear until you're almost on it, the lights finally reaching far enough ahead of the vehicle that the sediment comes into frame. Pale and fine, the color of old ash. We moved the ROV toward the anomaly on the sonar coordinates. The floor around it was typical for that depth. I've done enough deep work to recognize the normal population of the abyss, the occasional brittle star moving in its slow, deliberate way, bacterial mats in pale patches on the sediment, the scattered small architecture of deep sea life going about its business in the dark. It's sparse down there. Everything moves slowly, but it's alive. The anomaly came into frame gradually, not a sharp edge, more like the surrounding floor simply changed, the pale sediment giving way to something darker. The ROV's lights hit the surface of it, and the return was different from anything I'd seen the lights hit before. It wasn't rock. That was the first thing everyone in the room registered, and nobody said out loud immediately. Rock has a specific quality under deep sea lighting, the way it reflects, the variation in its surface, the way it breaks up the light. This surface didn't do that. It was consistent in a way that rock isn't. The texture of it, rendered on the screen, was something I have spent months since trying to describe accurately and have never quite managed. The closest I can get is somewhere between skin and bark, matte and dark and uninterrupted, with a fine surface variation that was too regular to be mineral and too large in scale to be anything biological I could name. We panned along it. It continued. We kept panning. It continued. For several minutes, We moved the camera along the surface of this thing, and it simply kept going in every direction, reaching to the edges of the lights and beyond, giving us no boundary, no end, no feature we could use to characterize what we were looking at. Just surface, just that dark, consistent, uninterrupted surface extending past everything we could illuminate. I noticed the other thing after a few minutes, the absence of life on it. The surrounding floor had its sparse population of deep-sea organisms. The surface of the anomaly had nothing. Not dead nothing, not the bleached, lifeless look of a toxic zone, just bare. The organisms on the surrounding floor moved right up to where the anomaly began, and then the boundary was clean. A hard line between populated and empty. Whatever those creatures were doing down there in the dark, navigating by whatever senses they used, they knew where the edge of this thing was, and they stopped there. Petra was standing next to me. She watched the feed in silence for a long time. Then she said she wanted historical survey data for this basin, as far back as we could source it. It took most of the afternoon to compile. She pulled from academic databases, from contractor archives, from records our company held going back to its founding. She contacted 2 colleagues at research institutions who had worked the North Pacific and asked them to check their own data holdings. She put in a records request that I later learned included some naval survey archives. By evening, she had returns going back 30 years. We went through them together at the main workstation, running the same comparison I'd done that morning, but extending it backward in time. 30 years of intermittent surveys of the same basin, different vessels, different equipment, different operators. The data quality improving decade by decade as the technology improved. The anomaly was in the oldest data we had, smaller, measurably, unambiguously smaller. The further back we went, the smaller it was, with a consistency that was itself significant, not fluctuating, not irregular, but a steady reduction in size as we moved backward through the surveys, like watching something grow in reverse, like watching something grow. Petra made me do the measurements while she watched. I think she wanted a second set of hands on the numbers, so she couldn't later tell herself she'd made an error. I measured the anomaly in each available survey, logged the date and the dimensions, and built a growth curve. Then I ran the extrapolation backward. If this thing had been growing at the rate the data suggested, what size would it have been at the beginning of that curve? And further back, before we had survey data precise enough to distinguish it from the surrounding geology? The answer was that it didn't start small. 30 years ago, it was already enormous, which meant it had been there, below the threshold of what earlier equipment could separate from geological background noise for a length of time that the growth rate made very difficult to think about directly. Not decades. The math didn't resolve into decades. I pushed back from the workstation. Petra sat with the numbers for a while. She didn't say anything dramatic. She asked me quietly if my methodology was sound. I told her it was. She looked at the growth curve on the screen for another minute. Then she said she wanted to run the ROV perimeter before the light failed. Station time, by which I mean before the crew rotation ended and we'd lose our most experienced operator on the vehicle controls. The perimeter run took 2 hours and 18 minutes. I know the exact time because I logged it. The ROV moved at consistent speed along what we hoped was the outer edge of the anomaly. following the boundary between the populated seafloor and the bare surface, trying to close a loop that would give us a total size estimate. The control room was quiet in a way it hadn't been all day. Not tense exactly, more like the specific quiet of people who are doing arithmetic in their heads and don't want to be interrupted. Everyone there had been watching the same data I'd been watching. Everyone there understood what the perimeter run was going to produce before it produced it. When the ROV closed the loop and we pulled the boundary trace and ran the area calculation, nobody said anything for a while. The number that came back was difficult to process in the way that some numbers are, not because they're complex, but because the scale of them doesn't fit comfortably inside normal thinking. The anomaly was larger than the United Kingdom, larger than several countries I could name, sitting in a basin 4 miles underwater in the North Pacific, growing slowly and consistently for at least 30 years of documented record, and almost certainly far longer than that. One of the other analysts in the room, a younger guy named Steph, who I'd worked with on 2 previous jobs, said something quiet that wasn't directed at anyone. He said he needed a minute and walked out. Petra stayed at the screen. I stayed with her. After a while, she said she was going to write up her preliminary findings and that she'd want my sonar analysis documentation to accompany them. She said it in the tone of someone performing normalcy, the way you do when normalcy is the only tool you have left. I said I'd have it ready by morning. Then I went out on deck. It was night by then. The Pacific, in the dark, a long way from shore, has a specific quality that I've always found settling. The size of it, the clean air, the particular silence of being far from any land. I've spent enough time on survey vessels that the ocean at night feels familiar to me, comfortable even. It didn't feel that way that night. I stood at the rail and looked at the water and thought about what was underneath it. Not here, we were well north of the survey area, but the thought didn't stay specific to the basin we'd been working. It spread, the way a thought does when you've pulled a thread and can't stop following where it goes. The ocean covers a little over 70% of this planet's surface. I knew that already, the way everyone knows it, as a fact that sits in the background of general knowledge without requiring much engagement. What I'd never really applied to that fact was the follow-up question of how much of it we'd actually looked at, not sailed across, looked at. Bottom surveys, at the kind of resolution that lets you distinguish a geological formation from something that doesn't belong. The number, when I'd looked it up once for an unrelated reason, was somewhere south of 30%. Some estimates put it lower. The specifics vary depending on what you count as adequate resolution. But the broad answer is the same. Most of the seafloor has never been surveyed in any meaningful detail. Most of those 4-mile basins, those deep trenches, those wide, flat, abyssal plains that go on for hundreds of miles without a feature. Nobody has looked at them with equipment capable of noticing a difference. We found what was in that basin because we happened to go back, because we'd surveyed it 4 years earlier for an unrelated reason, and we happened to rerun the survey with better equipment, and someone happened to do a direct comparison rather than just filing the new data and moving on. A specific, unlikely chain of circumstances that produced a result that wouldn't exist in any record if any one of those circumstances had been different. I thought about the other basins, the surveys that had never been run, the areas of the deep ocean that no cable route assessment or resource survey had ever reached, where the data in the academic databases was sparse or absent, the trenches deeper than our ROV could reach. I thought about the growth curve and what it implied about the timeline, about what the ocean floor looked like when that thing was small enough that no survey technology of the era could have found it, about how long it had been down there, in the dark, in the cold, growing at a rate so slow that any individual measurement would look like nothing. I thought about the fact that it had never done anything, had never moved based on 30 years of positional data, had never produced any signal or emission we detected, had never done anything at all except exist and grow 4 miles underneath a surface that human civilization had been crossing and fishing and building its history around for as long as human civilization had existed. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't tend toward dark thinking on ordinary nights. But standing at that rail, looking at the water, I couldn't locate the version of myself that felt settled by the ocean's size. That feeling had been replaced by something else. Not fear of what the thing might do. It hadn't done anything. There was no evidence it was capable of doing anything, or that it registered our presence, or that our presence meant anything to it at all. What I couldn't shake was simpler than that. And worse, we didn't find it because we were looking for it. We weren't. We'd surveyed that basin for a cable route and filed the data and gone home, and for 4 years that thing sat in the North Pacific, growing at its steady rate, while the results of our previous survey sat in an archive somewhere being nobody's concern. We stumbled onto it by accident through a chain of coincidences, and we almost didn't notice even then. The ocean is 360 million square kilometers, give or take. We found one. I went back inside. I wrote up my sonar analysis documentation. I filed it with Petra in the morning, and we finished the survey and headed back to port. The report went to the client, and then, I assume, to whoever clients pass things like that along to. I haven't heard anything about it since. Maybe that means that it's being handled. Maybe it means it isn't. I've done 2 survey jobs since. I do my calibration checks. I run my comparisons. I flag my anomalies the way I always have. But I pull the historical data now on every basin, every flat, featureless section of seafloor that the old surveys wrote off as unremarkable. I run the comparisons back as far as I can source the records. Most of the time it's nothing. Most of the time